Hello, everyone. I hope your semester is off to a good start. And I also hope that after covering some of the course material and watching my lecture, you have a better understanding of what we are going to cover in communication research. Let me share my screen with you. And as today, we're going to talk about research questions and hypotheses. So what is the first thing that you should consider when starting a research project? The first thing would be actually to ask yourself a question: where do I start? What do I want to study? Well, when conducting a research project, you can ask very simple questions. Some of those questions include: what motivates people to read the news? Or you can focus on a research study that explores online dating sites and ask a research question such as, why do people use online dating sites? Or your research question could be, what motivates young adults to use TikTok? Or how do internet users detect fake profiles on Twitter? But we can also ask other questions that are related to communication. They could be related to interpersonal communication, intercultural communication, communication in the workplace. So if you're, for instance, interested in studying communication in the workplace, you could ask a research question such as, do men and women exhibit different styles of nonverbal communication in the workplace? Or you can also ask a question: do men and women exhibit different styles of verbal communication in the workplace? Or if you're interested to see what are sources that people trust when it comes to COVID-19 vaccines, is it their doctor? Is it a news source that they usually rely on to obtain daily news? Or is it their best friend or somebody else? And in that case, you would start a study with the following research question: what sources that provide information about the COVID-19 vaccine do Americans trust? So these are just some of the research questions that you could start your study with if you're conducting communications related research. But aside from thinking of a specific question that you would like to address, the first thing that we take into consideration when we want to start a research project is our own perspective on research. So our own perspective of the world. So ask yourself at the beginning, how do you perceive the world? Do you feel that people are basically all alike? Or do you think that they are fundamentally different? Do you think that people are predictable or unpredictable? And also, do you think that people live in a shared world or in their own internal subjective world? So this specifically will determine the way you're going to conduct your research. What kind of worldviews do we identify? There are basically two worldviews that are very distinct. One worldview is called nomothetic, and its main assumption is that human behavior is predictable, objectively measurable, and generalizable. There is another approach called ideographic approach, and it is based on the assumptions that human behavior is individualistic, unpredictable, and subjective. What do you think about these two worldviews? Where do you feel, which one do you feel is more in line with qualitative research approach, and which one is in line with quantitative research approach? When we talk about generalizability, we're talking about numbers. So for that reason, the nomothetic approach basically is the approach embraced by those researchers that rely on the quantitative methods in research. And on the other hand, we have qualitative methods in research that are in line with the ideographic approach. But these worldviews are kind of very extreme. So there is either or. And for that reason, some other scholars decided to propose several other approaches that are either close to nomothetic or ideographic approach, but also they're more subtle. They're not as extreme as these two worldviews. So one of them is post-positive approach. So this approach is basically focused on the notion that there is no necessarily an absolute truth, but it emphasizes cause and effect, and it also tells us how there are certain laws in nature, in human communication as well, that we can base theories upon, and that we can later test and verify if our assumptions, if our theories are correct. So we can establish laws, but those laws could be tested, and we do test them all the time. We test our theories with hypotheses, we collect new data, we're trying to learn whether what we assume is the law in human communication is actually still correct. Is there still truth behind it, or do we have something else going on in human communication? So the law that we used to believe in, it doesn't exist anymore. Another viewpoint is constructivist, and unlike post-positive viewpoint that is more in line with that produces quantitative research, and that is more close to this nomothetic approach. Constructivist approach is closer to the worldview 2, or the worldview 2, or what we call ideographic approach. And it's basically based on an assumption that the world in which people live, they construct their own views. So there are no laws, and the human behavior should not be generalized because people have their own views, they construct them. And in this case, researchers predominantly rely on collecting data that brings some important information about human behavior, individual perspectives, their subjective perception of the world, and so on. Another approach or another worldview is transformative. So this one is close to the critical approach. You remember how we discussed critical approach in our previous video lecture. So this is basically oriented toward mixing research with politics, and the goal is to confront social oppression and to bring change. And this approach is specifically focused on groups that are marginalized. So the focus is on transforming and bringing changes to these groups. And finally, there's pragmatism. So pragmatism, of course, is an approach that is focused on finding solutions to problems. And this approach, usually, unlike if we look at post-positive approach that focuses primarily on quantitative research methods such as surveys or experiments or content analysis, or constructivist that focuses on qualitative research such as interviews and focus groups, pragmatism believes in finding solution by using different methods. So they rely on mixed method approach. So they would utilize methods that they believe would best provide an explanation or a solution to a problem. So it really, the way we're going to approach some phenomenon that we want to study really depends a lot on our perspective of the world. What do you believe? Like, think about what is it that you believe in. Do you believe that we're all alike, that there are patterns in human behaviors that could be generalized, or do you think that we're subjective? The way we see the world is different from the way other people see the world because of what's going on in our head and how we perceive it, and our own subjective world is different from the world that other people see. While post-positivists believe that there is this subjective reality that we can assess and measure. Now, what do we do in communication research, and how do we form these theories? So when we talk about when we talk about positivism, we talk about establishing theories and testing theories to see whether they work or not. So how do we come up with theories in communication research? How do we create theories? How do we say, this is the reason people use Netflix? What theories explain why do people use Netflix? How do we come up and create these theories? Well, there are several approaches, three actually. One of them is induction. Induction happens when we start from an observation and then we continue observing certain phenomena, and then we create a theory based on our observations. On the other hand, deduction goes the opposite way. We start with the theory, we start with some law that we believe exists in human communication, and then we collect data and we test that theory with observations. And the third approach is abduction, which is reasoning from an effect to possible causes. So we try to find the best possible explanation based on the information that we collected regarding some issues, some phenomena. So let's take a look at some examples. What does induction mean? What does deduction mean? So this is an example, a typical example that you will see every time you look, for example, about induction online. The sun rose this morning. So this is an individual observation. And then we start collecting data. So we made multiple observations about this. So the sun has risen every morning so far. So we made up multiple observations, and then we come up with this theory. So we come up with this universal law, something that is happening in nature, and that is the sun rises every morning. So we collect data and then we build theory upon that data. Deduction, on the other hand, goes the opposite way, as I mentioned, and this is an example. All birds can fly. So we start with the general statement, and then we say seagulls are birds, and we draw a conclusion that seagulls can fly. So we go from a more general statement to a specific one. When it comes to abduction, this process allows us to make a conclusion based on the information that is available to us. So at the end of this process, we should arrive at the best possible explanation of an issue. So think about this situation. You left your apartment. You came back to your apartment. You live with a roommate. And then suddenly when you return home, you realize that the lights were on in the hallway. It turns out that your roommate actually is not inside the place, and you're not sure why is it that the lights are on. Then you're thinking about what could have happened, and you conclude based on that information that you have and based on your experience with your roommate, you conclude that he probably rushed to work and accidentally left the lights on. It doesn't mean that this is correct, but this is actually the best possible explanation based on the information that you have collected. And what is the purpose of our research? So why do we do research, and why is it important for us to do research in communication? Let's take a look at some of the reasons for this. We can do it for just exploratory reasons. For instance, my research agenda from the beginning when I enrolled the PhD program was to examine the phenomenon of live blogging. So live blog is this journalistic format that allows you to deliver live updates on an event in motion. It could, such an event could be a breaking news event, or it can be a soccer game, a basketball game, or some major award ceremony. And I was just curious to learn about this format and what makes it so engaging. When I started exploring the phenomenon, that was back in 2014, live blogs were very popular, but not much of research was produced at that point in that area. So I started exploring. I wanted to learn why is it that people find this format that appealing. So I did this, I explored the phenomenon because it was under research, but you can also do research for different reasons. You can you just want to try to provide, for instance, description. You can look at Pace University campus and collect data about Pace University demographics. So see what's the percentage of male, female, how different ethnic groups are represented in the student body, what's the age range of your or of university students, and so on. And you can collect that data and simply produce a descriptive study. So the goal of your research could be just a description of the Pleasantville campus. Also, if we want to go further with our research, we could collect data and make predictions. So this is what usually people who work on political campaigns do. They collect data about people's attitudes toward different political parties, and then based on that, they make predictions on who is going to win elections. You can also collect data to provide some form of explanation, but researchers also collect data for control purpose, and that is especially evident in marketing research, or simply you want to control the audience, you want to control consumers, or you want to collect research data to control certain other processes in nature or in society. So these are some of the reasons why we conduct research. But how do we start? So we talked at the beginning about posing a research question, thinking about what our perspective of the world is. What do we think? Are people alike, or are they different? Do we all have different perspectives about the world? And then what is it that I want to study? So you pick a topic, you choose, like you have an idea of what you want to study, but what is the next thing that you are going to do? So you're going to pose that research question, and then you want to look and identify key constructs and operationalize them. What does it mean? What are constructs? So constructs are ideas or broad concepts. People usually have a problem distinguishing between concepts and constructs. So what is basically the difference between the two? On one hand, concepts are specific. So a concept can be weight, income, age, while constructs are more abstract. So operationalizing constructs means defining them in a way that can be measured. So let's see, an example of construct could be attitudes toward immigration. So how do you know whether somebody has positive or negative attitudes toward immigration? So you need to create a scale of several variables that will assess people's attitudes. So it's not just one question that you're going to ask, for instance, in a survey to see whether people have positive or negative attitudes toward immigration, but you're going to ask a list of questions to assess this construct called attitudes toward immigration. So what we do in research is we operationalize constructs into variables. Variables are the aspects of a construct that are capable of being measured or taking on a value. So I prepared an example for you. So I mentioned this example, attitudes toward immigration, but there are also other concepts that you could relate with, such as academic performance. So when you say that somebody is successful, somebody is a successful student, what do you mean? So what does it mean to be a successful student? Are you only referring to that person's GPA? Or if that is a graduate student, are you saying that they also, aside from having good grades, have they also published some research studies or presented their papers at the conference? Have they participated in any other important activities? So basically, it is difficult to say that you're not providing the entire picture about somebody's performance based only on their GPA. So that's why I want to make sure that you are measuring properly this concept, and that concept is academic performance by utilizing diverse variables. And those variables include class rank, number of academic awards, current GPA, cumulative GPA, class participation is rated by faculty, number of membership in academic honor society, and class attendance. So you basically assess all of these variables, and then you do your calculation to measure their academic performance. So it's not just one question that you ask, but you actually need to collect all this data to assess this construct academic performance. Now let's take a look at what is it that you do at the beginning of your study. You ask research questions, hypotheses, and that's the crucial part of today's lecture. What is a hypothesis? It is a statement about the relationship that we expect to find between variables. A research question, on the other hand, is being posed when there is no certainty to make a prediction. So what do you think? In which case do you pose hypothesis? In which case do you pose research question? When it comes to testing certain laws in human communication, do you think that you would start your research study with a hypothesis or a research question if you want to test something? Remember when I mentioned the deduction process, when you start with the law and then you collect data to see whether that law still stands or not. So that basically means that you're going to create a hypothesis, and then you will determine whether that law still stands or not. So in that case, you are testing a theory. But if there is no a sufficient amount of data to make a prediction, then you'll be asking a research question. We have different types of hypotheses. One of them is two-tailed. That is when you create a hypothesis that describes this relationship with no direction. So an example could be there is a relationship between the frequency of consuming alcohol and academic performance. So this hypothesis that is two-tailed states that there is a relationship, but it doesn't really tell us in which direction that relationship goes. Another one is one-tailed. In this case, this hypothesis predicts the direction of the relationship. So for example, the hypothesis that is one-tailed would be as alcohol consumption increases, academic performance decreases. So don't drink too much if you want to have like a good academic standing. The null hypothesis, on the other hand, assumes that there is no relationship at all. So that hypothesis would be there is no relationship between the frequency of consuming alcohol and academic performance. Research questions are a bit different from a hypothesis. So instead of like testing a theory, we're asking a specific research question to see if to reveal something new. So some examples of research questions include, is there a relationship between involvement in video gaming and academic performance? This is an open-ended research question. We can also pose closed-ended research questions, and an example of such question would be, does academic performance decline as involvement in video game increases? Some other examples of research questions, and I'm giving you these examples because you're going to work on your research study, and I want you to think about potential research questions or potential areas of research that you would like to engage with. And some other questions in communication research could be, is there a relationship between the frequency of consuming alcohol and academic performance? Or does academic performance decline as the frequency of consuming alcohol increases? I think I had a student once who actually posed a similar research question. It wasn't just related to the use of alcohol, it was related to use of marijuana. And finally, once you determine your research question, you need to think of the method that you are going to utilize to collect data. So in these two cases, which method do you feel would be the most appropriate for collecting data? Like, how would you collect data? Are you going to do interviews, or are you going to do surveys, or will you use some other method to answer these questions? In this case, probably the most appropriate method would be to conduct a survey. Why? It is because you're going to ask a question. You're going to ask a lot of questions. So you're going to ask questions about the frequency of alcohol consumption. So you're going to ask them questions about how many drinks did you have in the past week, for instance, or you're going to ask them about their GPA, about scholarly awards, and so on. Or you can collect data from the school for individual students, and then you can ask separately questions about their alcohol consumption patterns. And based on that data, you will answer these questions, these research questions. If you look at these different methods, which methods do you believe fall into quantitative and which methods fall into qualitative research? I think I touched upon this last week, but what do you think about surveys? So I mentioned the frequency of using alcohol. That's something that you would ask students and answer that research question based on the responses that you obtain from the students. So if you look at this surveys, you're asking about numbers, and that is what? It's not qualitative. It's really, it falls into the domain of quantitative research. Why? It's because we're talking here about numbers. We are measuring something. So we are measuring academic performance, and we are measuring the extent to which people drink. So how many drinks they have each week? What's the frequency? So frequency is illustrated with numbers. So that's why this research is quantitative. When it comes to experiments, we are looking at the cause and effect. It is also quantitative research. Interviews, on the other hand, are qualitative, focus groups as well. And when it comes to content analysis, it can be both quantitative and qualitative. And observations are very subjective. Thus, we would connect them to what? Qualitative approach. And which worldview? Ideographic or nomothetic? Ideographic, right. So because we're interested in subjective personal perspectives of people, their experiences, that's why this falls into the category of qualitative research. Now, based on this lecture, I have an exercise for you. So this exercise will basically lead you to your first assignment. And what I want you to do is write 2 research questions or hypotheses for the research study you're planning to conduct this semester. So either 2 research questions or 2 hypotheses. Identify key constructs in your questions, hypothesis, and identify the method you would use in your research. Explain the purpose and significance of your study, then post your essay under research questions and hypotheses. I want you to write about 250 words. Okay. Now let's just one more time take a look at the key concepts that we covered today. So we talked about different approaches, different worldviews. If you are a person who embraces nomothetic approach, you are that person who is likely to conduct quantitative research, to utilize surveys, content analysis, experiments in their research. If you're more likely to embrace this ideographic approach, then you're a qualitative research who is going to use methods such as interviews, focus groups, qualitative content analysis, ethnography. But remember, there, as I mentioned, there are other approaches as well. We are looking at 2 really distinct probably extreme approaches, but there are other approaches as well. And certainly in your research, you don't need to rely only on one method. You can use a mixed method approach. I also have experience of using both quantitative and qualitative methods. I have different studies. In some studies, qualitative research methods were more appropriate to answer questions that I asked. In some other studies, quantitative approach was most suitable to answer those questions that I posed in that study. Other concepts include deduction, induction, and abduction. We talked about research questions and hypotheses, and that was the heart of this lecture. And of course, concepts, constructs, and variables. Again, concepts are more specific than constructs that are very abstract. And to understand and assess constructs, we need to operationalize them into variables. And finally, we talked about research methods. So as you complete your exercise, remember to write, what do you think, which research method would be most appropriate for your research? Is it survey, interview, ethnography, or is it focus groups, or something else? Okay. And that is all that I have for you for today. This is my reference list. And thank you very much. I really appreciate your attention. If you have any questions, you can send me an email or request a meeting with me. Have a good week. Bye-bye.